Warning: this video contains spoilers for Dark Souls 2. If you haven't played all the way through it and you plan to, I'd advise you to quit watching now. As Alva the Wayfarer cautiously stepped into the room at the side of the wide hallway, he took a second to prepare himself to be ambushed by yet more grotesque atrocities created by that monster Aldia. To his surprise, his eyes were met with an empty lab, a stairway leading further down at the opposite end. Something related to the cure he was once again searching for might be found here, so the knight decided to make his way around the room. Many odds and ends were strewn about haphazardly, including what looked to be a piece of what was once an all-too-precious bonfire. There were bottles of some sort of bright green substance everywhere, which bathed the room in a sickly green light. Frustration began to well up in the weathered knight, seeing nothing that indicated it might help him save his precious Saint Soretta. The only piece of research he could even find was something about some Experiment 17, another monster Aldia had created. What did Alva take up the sword again for, if there was nothing here to help him on his quest? Why did Zuli have to die to that wretched skeletal dragon, if it didn't mean Soretta could be resurrected? Surely, if men can live, can die, and can be given the curse of painful immortality through hollowing, there had to be some way to revive someone who had succumbed to such a curse. Aldia specialized in such research, so where was it? Alva calmed himself down with a deep breath before readying his blade once more and beginning the trek downstairs. Within a few steps, the sight of large iron bars and a floor soaked in some sort of vile-looking liquid came into view. There was something in the far back of the room, sitting in the very corner. It was a man. Alva's heart leapt before he reined himself back in. Caution was his friend here. Not every monstrosity Aldia created had to look like it came from your deepest nightmares, and Alva knew he would do well not to trust a face just because it was human on the surface. He'd made that mistake before. The strange man's hair was of a stark white, which continued down into a rather respectable beard. Across his face was some sort of tattoo that was just as bright of a white as his hair. He was all but completely naked, sitting curled up in the back of the cell. His expression was blank as he stared deeply into the liquid he was forced to stew in. The man in the cell slowly looked up at Alva, who grasped the door cautiously and pulled. It was locked. This had to be some sort of trap. It just had to be. But what if his answers were here? He just couldn't risk missing something that could help him. Going against his better judgment, Alva used one of the first enchantments Zuli had taught him so long ago, fortifying his blade in a bright blue layer of sorcery. He placed it between the door and the large iron bars which the locking mechanism pierced to hold the door shut. With all of his might, he pushed on the handle and the face of his blade, bending the iron of the cell until the lock snapped, several pieces of iron falling into the shallow liquid below. Alva's gaze was far too preoccupied with the man in front of him to notice the fallen metal dissolving completely in just seconds. As Alva began to open the door slowly, the eyes on the strange man before him grew in what seemed to be fear. Before Alva could do anything, the large muscular man was upon him, having sprinted quickly across the cell. He wrapped his arms around Alva's torso and tackled him just outside of the cell. Alva's helmet left his head and his sword left his grasp. He caught sight of them both dissipating into the liquid before throwing a punch at his attacker. The steel of his gauntlet echoed a sickening crack against the jaw of the man before him, who tumbled off to the side. The both of them stood up, Alva much more quickly than his opponent, who seemed to suddenly be reluctant to fight. Alva was furious about losing his sword and swore to get payback for it. He had no choice but to put this foul creature out of its misery, just like all of the others so far. Alva reached to his side and pulled out a small dagger, thrusting it forward before his enemy could do anything. It stabbed through abdomen like butter, before being retracted and thrust once more into the chest. He shot the dagger forward several more times, screaming angrily as he did so. Eventually, the white-haired man crumpled in front of him, bloodied and full of holes. Alva sighed in relief, proudly awaiting the souls that he was to acquire. But they never came. Looking closely at the corpse in front of him, he noticed it move, and his eyes look up at him. Though his skin had already started to grow a dirty green color like that of an undead, it reverted to a lively tan just as quickly, his wounds healing up entirely. He was standing back up. Alva pushed the man to the floor before he could stand all the way up, raising his dagger above his head and using it to pierce the monster's skull. He left the blade there, standing up in awe. He prayed that the ordeal was over. It wasn't. Once again, the beast before him started to stand back up, his skull healing as he pulled the blade out from his forehead. Tossing it to the ground at Alva's feet, he surrendered completely in silence. Before Alva could react, there was a rustling and a roar at the top of the stairs. He gasped in fear as several of Aldia's other demons began descending on them both. He rushed to grab the dagger, but it was too late. Not like it would have been much use anyway. He wasn't being singled out, however, as the strange man struggled to fend several of the monstrosities off of himself with his bare hands. As soon as he had himself free, the man fought to help Alva as well. But Alva would never know of this, for he was just as dead as the monsters by the time all was said and done. The man simply looked at Alva for a while, hoping he would get up. But he never did. So it was true then. Not everyone was like he was. Not everyone could survive death. Only those with the curse Aldia hated so much could come back to life. The man sulked back into his corner, disheartened by what just happened. He was only trying to help. He knew the consequences of trying to enter a cell with any items in your possession. He just wanted to protect this traveler from losing anything to the acid. He definitely was going to be punished when Aldia came back. Aldia hadn't been around in a long, long time, but he was going to be furious when he saw the mess outside of the cell. The man just stared into his faint reflection in the liquid, waiting patiently to be punished. Although he had no concept of time, years and years went by, with nobody else coming down those stone steps, not even his creator. Years of thoughts went through his head as he sat there, wondering where everyone was, and what was outside of the room he'd stayed in his whole life. He knew that he was connected to the bonfires somehow. He'd heard the mumblings of his master during research. He was immortal as long as he was near a bonfire. He knew there used to be many of them beyond his cell, including the one hidden behind the wall nearby that kept him from perishing. But were any of them left? If he moved from the safety of his bonfire, would he slowly decay like Alva's body had? Eventually, curiosity got the better of him. Standing up, the man vowed to find answers to his questions, even if it one day led to his death, assuming he could even die. He made his way to Alva's dusty, skeletal remains and apologized in his head as he delicately stole the armor off of the corpse. There wasn't much he could do to repay Alva for his mistakes, other than carry on some sort of legacy through his armor. Luckily enough, it fit rather well. Fear entered his trembling body as he made his way up the stairs for the first time. At the top was some of the research Aldia had been doing, cobwebs covering it all. At the far end of the room were two swords sitting on a shelf. The blades were twisted near the hilt, and the tips were eternally red hot. He grabbed these two relics of once safe havens, and ventured on in search of his creator, and in search of answers. It wasn't long before he learned the state of the world before him. Dangerous monsters and demons were everywhere, leading to several instances where the man ended up painfully crawling miles back to the nearest bonfire to rest. Luckily, there were still quite a few of these flames wherever he traveled. It took him a while, but he eventually learned how to use his weapons in conjunction with well-timed maneuvering. And that wasn't all he learned either. He met several rather kind people while traveling, and many more that weren't so kind. He learned that some of these people were from a different realm of sorts, just like the thousands of ghosts that constantly phased in and out of existence wherever he went. He learned about the king, and the fact that Aldia was once his brother before being cast away for his experiments. He learned that Drang Lake was the name of this land, and it was slowly dying because of the curse. Part of him understood Aldia's research more now that he knew he was only trying to fight the curse, but he could never forgive the creation of so many monstrosities that killed just as many people as the effects of hollowing did. Those experiments may have brought him into existence, but he'd gladly have given his own life up if the land was also to be free of Aldia's other creatures. It seemed that many of these creatures were derived from something called a giant. Such a vague title didn't adequately describe to him what exactly a giant was, but he didn't seem to come across any of them. That is, until one came across him. The man had spent quite a while fighting his way through ruins deep in a forest rife with hollow soldiers. Eventually, he found his way to an elevator above a pit full of flame-spewing lizards. Stepping on the button, he rode it quite a ways down to a long hallway. At the very end, he could hear the melancholy groans of a massive beast, and loud crashing sounds coming through a small doorway. Just as he began his way down the hall, he saw a woman dive past the door, a foot that was easily twice her size coming down in the very spot where she'd just been standing a second ago. Quickly readying his blades, he sprinted down the hallway and through the door. There it was. A giant. There was no other explanation for a creature so huge. It was easily as tall as the tallest house in Majula. Despite its size, the monster looked frail and emaciated, and though there was a gaping hole where there should have been a face, something about it still felt extremely sorrowful. Taking a second to glance at the woman to see if she was safe, the two of them locked eyes, just long enough for her to be backhanded by the giant, sending her flying into the wall nearby. The giant then went for him, forcing his attention back on the task at hand. Once, twice, thrice were the slashes that pierced the ankle of the giant, before it was time to go on the defensive. Just after his dodge, he took a second to make sure the woman was still okay. She'd finally gotten herself back to her feet, and was now sipping from a great orange flask. As soon as the substance inside touched her lips, her demeanor changed entirely to that of someone who was more than ready for round two. Full of vigor, she jumped back into the fray. She was clearly much more skilled than him, however, for when the battle was finally over, she was the only one left standing. Her strange comrade had been utterly destroyed by the giant, and she was surprised he was even still breathing. Through the blood that covered his body and pooled on the rocks below, she could see that his skin looked like that of a hollow. So as quickly as she could, she grabbed him and started dragging him toward the nearby bonfire just up the elevator. To her surprise, however, by the time she got him to the ladder, he was already able to stand up entirely by himself. He didn't look perfect, but he looked much more healthy than he had just 2 minutes before. Shocked, she motioned for him to follow him up the ladder, where the warm light of the bonfire was waiting for them. As she sat down to rest, she noticed that his skin was somehow back to the state of a healthy human. The two of them sat in silence for a few minutes, while she checked her gear and refilled her flask. Now that he finally had a moment to really look at her, he noticed that her skin was like that of a hollow too, so she must already be a victim of the curse. But just as he began to wonder what she was doing out here battling a giant of all things, she reached into her bag and pulled out some strange object. It seemed to be what looked like a cage of twigs surrounding a tiny soul locked inside. She smashed it into her chest, breathing deeply as her skin reverted back to that of a healthy human. Was she immortal too? Now turning to him, she asked him who he was. He'd have answered if he could have, but it was impossible. Aldea may have granted him some perversion of everlasting life, but he wasn't given the luxury of a voice. All he could do was sigh, looking down at the fire. Not seeming to get the message, the young woman asked him if he at least had a name. Until then, he'd never really realized that he had no title to call his own. Thinking back to Aldea's research, he pondered over his creator's mumblings for a few seconds. Mumblings about his own creation as Experiment 17. He was supposedly crafted from the remains of two powerful beings from a past world entirely. One was a being of pure darkness, whose soul fractured into several pieces when he'd been mysteriously defeated by who knows what. He was believed to be the origin of darkness and was possibly once human before being warped into becoming a monster. The other was a saint who cast himself into a bonfire to save the world. This man had supposedly once been a deity before abandoning his godhood to find his own light. His bones still remained within the bonfires across the land, some of which Aldea had painstakingly collected. Two opposites brought together to create a failed attempt at immortality. The remains of two gods fused into an experiment that would itself eventually wither away into dust, once the final fires died out. That was it. That was what he would be called. Getting up from the fire, the man ran his fingers through the still fresh blood caked across his face. In the dim flicker of the firelight, the letters he wrote in blood shimmered faintly across the wall. When all was said and done, the word dust was written on the cobblestone. It wasn't long before the two adventurers resigned themselves to traveling together. Her search for a cure for the curse aligned well enough with his own search for his once master Aldea, so on and on they ventured, always making sure to have each other's backs. They fought many a demon along the way, and Dust watched as she grew ever stronger with each soul she consumed. It was startling for him to watch her exhibit such masterful skills and ruthlessness on the battlefield, since she was so incredibly kind and soft-spoken in their downtime at the bonfires. Even if their goals didn't line up, it wasn't long before he couldn't imagine not following her to the ends of the earth. She was by far the most personal being Dust had ever come across. Her kind voice soothed his wretched, stolen soul. In a world so full of hatred and despair, she was a beacon of determination and light, brighter than any bonfire. Dust's skills grew along with her power, and she made sure to train him for whatever next stood in their way. Their knowledge grew with each new realm they explored. They learned more about the king, and they learned about his queen's betrayal. They learned about linking the fires and how it quelled the curse, if only temporarily. They visited a great iron castle that was sinking into a sea of magma. They fought more of Aldia's creations, even teaming up with a half-scorpion, half-man ally who begged them to put his once-love out of her misery. They somehow traveled into the memories of people during the war with the giants. They struggled through everything together. Eventually, the two of them had to face off with what was left of the king himself, and even an ancient dragon Aldia had somehow fashioned from the soul of a giant. The more they learned about the world, the darker it became. The realization that Drangleic wasn't even the only kingdom to fall to the curse was the hardest for them both. It seemed like every shred of hope was crumbling before them. But this only steeled Dust's compatriot's will, as she was now determined to link the flame to hold the curse at bay. Strangely, most of these kingdoms seemed to fall thanks to the corruption of their queen. These women came from the same being of darkness as Dust. Part of his soul was entwined with theirs. He didn't want to be like them. He didn't want to seek the darkness of a world without flame. He didn't want to be part of a world where his soul friend was doomed to hollowing. This kept him going. Soon enough, though, it was time. The two of them stepped into view of the Throne of Want, only to see Queen Nashandra standing in their way. Her warped appearance was only outdone by her warped hatred for the fire King Vendrick and so many others tried to protect. Yet still, there was something just as sad about facing off against her as there was way back when they'd fought the last giant. She never had any choice in life, the darkness of her soul dictating every action she'd ever taken. It was the shade of her soul that drove her lust to betray kingdoms and spread the black of the abyss. The fight was a fierce one, but together Dust and his comrade took Nashandra down. Before they could even catch their breath, however, someone spoke to them from somewhere nearby. The voice was one Dust felt he recognized. It announced that nobody had ever come this far. Nobody had ever been this close to subduing the curse, and now he was to be their final test. Aldia appeared before the weakened pair, who'd been through hell and back to get to this point. He was no longer the Aldia Dust had once known, instead being nothing more than a giant mass of flame and kindling. Dust looked away from his creator toward his dear friend. The curse was taking its toll on the young woman as she struggled to hold up her greatsword. Shaking, she pulled her final human effigy from her bag. She smashed it into her chest, once again donning the guise of humanity. Dust wasn't honestly doing much better, being almost completely hollow after the fight with Nashandra. For the first time in a long time, Dust feared for himself. Even if they had access to another human effigy, he'd long since learned that they did nothing to affect him. He wasn't really human after all. Raising his blades, he readied himself regardless. It wasn't long, however, before he began to feel strength welling up inside himself. Something was reverting the damage Nashandra had done. Something was giving him power. It was Aldia. That must be it. Aldia's grotesque transformation into a demon of fire must have been linked to the experiments with bonfires. Dust couldn't lose, Aldia's obsession being his own undoing. Strange though, because as Dust leapt into the air and buried his blades deep in Aldia's hide, he could almost feel relief spread throughout Aldia. It was as if Aldia knew all along that he was going to lose. It was as if he wanted everything to end for a long, long time, having failed to cure the curse himself. Flames erupted everywhere as Aldia roared in pain before he unceremoniously faded away. Dust breathed a sigh of relief. His goal, he'd finally accomplished it. His master could no longer create any more monstrosities. But now, came the hardest part of the journey. The young woman he'd come so far with. She could no longer soothe him with her voice, as she had a job to do. The two of them knew what came next. They'd known for some time. They simply stared intently in silence for a few seconds before she nodded toward him, bowed, and said goodbye. She then turned toward the Throne of Want as a pathway grew before her. This was her fate, to become another legendary warrior just like that which gave Dust his name and his existence. She was to continue this age of fire. Dust stayed silently, watching until the door to the throne closed, leaving him alone. It took a while before he could get up the courage to move himself. He simply stared off into the distance, cementing the memories of his closest friend forever in his mind. As he walked down the steps back toward the castle, he couldn't help but wonder what happened next. All he knew was that he had a promise to keep to his dear friend, a legacy to continue for his corrupted master, and a duty to all of those struggling in this cruel world. His goal was to find some way to truly end the curse. Hey you guys, I know I don't normally talk during my end cards, but I just wanted to say I'm not completely finished with overhauling all of the aesthetics for the channel. I'm sure you've seen a few of the pieces go up, but I haven't finished the intro or anything yet. Hopefully I'll have it done by the next video, but I'm not guaranteeing anything. Other than that, I hope you enjoyed watching this video, and I hope you like the idea of story mode, as I think I'm going to call this. Eventually, I want this to become a little bit more regular part of the channel. I want it to be something that interests people and fosters creativity, where you guys can maybe even submit your own stories someday. I think this has potential to be a really interesting idea, so tell me what you guys think. Anyway, I'll let you get on with it. Thanks for watching, and see you next week.